Hello and welcome everyone back to War Diplomacy. This is a podcast where we analyze geopolitical developments and international affairs. I am your current host, Fabio Almada, talking to you live from Brussels. And I think today's topic is of crucial importance for those that follow global politics as much as us. Those that listen to the Spanish version of the podcast, you know how we've discussing these past weeks about maybe the death of multilateralism and how maybe the world is getting separated in different blocks and different confronted sides. So I think this is a really interesting topic to address. And until up a few years ago, there was like this general consensus that the US was the world's dominant economic, cultural, and military power. But in the past few years, it's no mystery that China has this international rise, and many talk about this challenge to the US-led liberal order and questioning this narrative of US dominance, right? So Russia is also one of those countries that's been moving the closest to China. And I think that's the main issue that we will discuss in this episode. How strong is this partnership between Russia and China? Where are their weaknesses? And how this relation will develop in the wake of current affairs. So in order to learn more about this issue, I'm joined here today by my fellow War Diplomacy co-host, Aramis, and Oleksiy as well, Oleksiy Otkinac. Some of you may know from previous episodes in the Spanish version and one of other here in English as well. So just please, for our listener, disclaimer that, of course, as much as we're enthusiastic about these topics, we are not senior experts in this area, but I think it's fair to say that we have dealt with this topic quite a lot, both professionally and academically. So I think we have some interesting things to say. How are you, Aramis?
Thank you, Fabio. I'm doing fine. Excited for today's episode. And I just wanted to briefly sketch out what our listeners can expect from this recording today. So first of all, one would assume that we will start by showing you why China and Russia are the perfect partners in international relations. But we will actually do the opposite. And first, we will analyze looming conflicts between the two countries. And then in the second block, we will explain why China and Russia have become partners nevertheless. And finally, we will look at the latest developments, allowing you to learn more about the two countries from various perspectives. And Oleksiy, how are you doing today?
Hello, Fabio. Hello, Aramis. Hello, everybody who is listening us all around the world. From my side, I will try to bring you some insights, not in the unique way, but sometimes is not very popular way, because I have an ability to read all the literature about Russian and Chinese relations in Russian and Ukrainian. So I think these insights would be interesting for you, and I will try my best to share it with you.
No, Oleksiy, I think that is wonderful. And at the end, for those that do not know, Oleksiy is there in Ukraine and he worked with these issues. He's the link between journalists that go to Ukraine and try to record what's happening in the war. So I think, Oleksiy, it's definitely really interesting information that you can bring up. And I think Aramis and I will really try to push for that academic and historical angle to give a well-rounded episode. So yeah, without further ado, Aramis, I think it's time to start with this episode.
So from 9/11 to World War II, every country has its narratives on historical events that guide its behavior in international relations. And one of the most central narratives to understand the Chinese mindset is the so-called Century of Humiliation, which lasted from 1839 to 1949. During this period, China lost almost all wars it fought, forcing it to sign unequal treaties with unpleasant conditions. So, among other things, it had to cede territory, pay reparations, and open its ports for trade. For example, allowing for the import of opium. And for many Chinese, the lesson of this century is clear. If China is weak, powerful countries will force it into subjugation. And therefore, they conclude that China must be powerful and stand up against its bullies. And it's commonly known that Western countries and Japan are among the bullies cited in this historical narrative. But what we often forget is that Russia also played a quite important role during the Century of Humiliation. In 1858, China's Qing dynasty was in an unprecedented crisis due to a civil war and the Second Opium War against the British and the French. And in this context, the Russian Empire amassed tens of thousands of troops on the Qing dynasty's border and demanded that the Qing dynasty cedes a huge chunk of its territory called Outer Manchuria. And not wanting to open up another front, the Qing dynasty gave in to the Russian demands in a 1860 treaty, and it ceded a territory the size of modern Ukraine. And to this day, this land is part of the Russian Federation. And Chinese nationalists have not forgotten about this. From Mao Zedong, the first Chinese communist leader, until today, there have been tensions because of this land grab more than 150 years ago. So, Alexei, what do you think is the strategic relevance of this territory today?
I would say that mostly this piece of land is the key, is the window for Russia to Asia. And we should remember that Russian-Japanese War, which took place in 1904, 1905, took place because of struggle between Russia and Japan for this Chinese territory. So both countries were claiming this territory, and both countries were competing for their influence in Asia. And Russia could, in one way or another, keep these territories. Yes, Russia lost some of the territories because of this Russian-Japanese war, but overall, Russia kept this influence in Asia. And for Russia, Vladivostok as the main an exit for Russia to Pacific Ocean is the base of their Pacific Fleet, Pacific Ocean Navy, and obviously Russia will never cede these territories because they open the gates for Russia to Korea, to China, to Japan, and to the whole influence in Asia.
And for China, it's an important territory as well, of course, because for them, it would, if China owned this territory, it would allow them to access the Sea of Japan directly, or as some Chinese nationals call it, the North China Sea. So there is not only this historical dimension, but they also have a concrete geopolitical interest to own this piece of territory, at least from the perspective of certain Chinese nationalists. But getting back to Russia being increasingly dependent on China, do you think that China has plans to bring Outer Manchuria back to its territory?
As from my perspective, I don't think that that China has some plans to get back these territories really for now, because they are very successful colonizing these territories. If we take the number of Chinese settlers there during the last decades, if we take into consideration the Chinese investments in these territories, if we take into consideration number of contracts and very often very unclear contracts with local governments from Chinese side, we will see that China successfully is receiving the whole variety of resources which are there, wood, oil, diamonds, and so on and so on. So I think that all the benefits which this territory could give to China, China receives now with a relatively cheap price. China doesn't have to struggle a war with Russia. China don't have any sanctions because of the annexation of some territories. But in return, China receives the whole advantage of this territory.
But then again, if we look at it from a midterm perspective and think of the fact that there are increasingly Chinese people living in that region, or people with Chinese descent, and then we have also a growing Chinese capacity and a growing dependence of Russia towards China, then maybe one could say that in the future this could become a contested issue, and China would gradually try to gain influence in that region and then maybe claim the territory, especially if we take into consideration that Russia itself has ignored the international law in Ukraine. So personally, I don't want to say that China will do it, but I think it's within the realm of possibilities in a midterm perspective. But what do you think about it, Fabio?
Well, Armis, I think it's definitely an interesting topic and hypothesis. I mean, looking more of maybe the broad geopolitical status of the world, I think I agree a little bit more with Alexei that I do not think that it would be a cause of tension. Maybe in the medium and maybe even long term, especially because China's main geopolitical objective, I would say, it's really focused in Taiwan. But I think that still it's really interesting, and the listeners might say, why are these guys talking about territorials in Central Asia when now the focus is all in Ukraine and the fight against like Western liberalism? But at the end, I think to understand the partnership between Russia and China, you do need to understand that there's some tension, right? That China and Russia are not just like you said in the beginning of the episode, the perfect partners that maybe some people might think they are, right? I think that we need to understand that both of them are collaborating. As at the end here in War Diplomacy, we have that realist vision, and they are cooperating not because of the sake of cooperation and because they are true best friends, as Putin and Xi Jinping say, but because they have common objectives, which in this case is their antagonism with the Western world. But it's interesting to realize that there are points of friction between their borders as well, right? And just as Oleksiy has said, this is a huge door to Asia, and it has been the cause of wars before. And you know what they say, right? Like history sometimes rhymes. I don't think that it would be the case in the coming years, but who knows? Just as you said, Aramis, there's a lot of Chinese citizens, and maybe that's going to grow in the future, and that might be a cause of also some revolts there. And who knows? Maybe China could use that in the future to make some types of moves or have certain leverage, right?
And that is not the only contested region the two countries are having tensions about. And we do not only have Outer Manchuria, which is in the southeast of Russia or the northeast of China, but there is also Central Asia, which is home to 5 post-Soviet countries: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And from a Russian perspective, these countries should be part of their direct sphere of influence, because Central Asia is characterized by flat plains, and it could become a potential door to invade Russia, at least according to Russian military strategists. But notwithstanding, China is investing a lot of effort to pull these countries towards Beijing, facilitated by the Belt and Road Initiative. So now you have oil and gas pipelines running from Central Asia to China, and China is the most important trade partner of the region. And it's also stepping up its military presence in the region. So, Oleksiy, do you think that Central Asia could then cause a major dispute between Russia and China?
I would quickly add a small but very important comment on our previous part. China doesn't need obligatory invade Russia to control these territories. We have to bear in mind two very important factors. First, the skepticism which exists in the people in Vladivostok, in that region of Russia, which is closer to Japan and China. In Vladivostok, people don't like Moscow a lot. And even in 1990s, there were some separatist movements against Moscow, some efforts to create a Siberian Republic or something. So who knows? Maybe one day in a map there will be Vladivostok People Republic or something like this, and some people from there will have Chinese weapons, which is they found on the ground. The same way, the same hybrid warfare which Russia began in Ukraine could be turned against Russia. The same schemes, the same tactics. Regarding the Central Asia, I think here we have to remember about other very strong players which are in the region, namely Turkey and Pakistan, which have their own views on some of the Central Asia countries. I think the clash between Russia and China is further from their direct clash, and maybe today we will see some kind of, not the Cold War, but competition for the economic influence and political influence. But even if Russia will not lose its war in Ukraine completely, their influence in Central Asia dropped dramatically. Kazakhstan permits itself the behavior that they would never permit themselves before the full-scale invasion to Ukraine, and they criticize Russia sometimes. So I think that we really will see the competition there. The direct clash between Russia and China, for now, I think it's kind of far perspective.
Oleksiy, the question I have in this context, because I'm always wondering, is why are the Russians so, at least for now, calm about this situation with China? Because if the West is interfering in the Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, then Russia is very active and, of course, if we, as we are seeing in the war in Ukraine, also aggressive and violent to defend its position. But then when we think of Central Asia, then we see that Russia is losing a lot of influence and there are other countries stepping up their presences there. But Russia does not seem to be so invested in those changes. Why is that the case?
I would say that this is because very particular Russian specific internal point of view on the world. The whole 20th century, Russian psychology was developing around the idea that the West won't destroy the Soviet Union because Soviet Union is the first socialist state in the world, and the whole world is a capitalist world. So the world capitalist class won't destroy the Soviet Union. So anti-Western propaganda is something that the whole generations were raised on, and anti-Western propaganda is much easier for Russian people to understand. Even the Russian Empire, which was very connected to the West, which was part of the global West, also was sometimes very anti-Western, and anti-Western propaganda existed in Russia since 19th century. So anti-Western propaganda is the easiest way in Russia to create some external enemy. It's the most understandable external enemy. That's why they can allow to China to do whatever China wants in Central Asia, and that's why they are reacting in some aggressive way to any developments in Europe.
Yes, thank you, Alexei. So I think to sum it up, it's fair to say that Russia is losing ground in what it would frame as its sphere of influence, but so far it has not acted up on this, and it has not taken any actions against China in reaction to that. But it's certainly an issue that may cause tension in the future. But I think it's fair to sum up the first block here and now get towards the second block that goes from the tensions towards the reasons why those two countries have chosen to cooperate so strongly on the international level.
All right, guys. So I think that for this second block, we can name it the love triangle of global politics, because since the end of the Cold War, Russia, China, and the US repeatedly swapped partners. We can think about this ideological connection between the USSR and China with communism, but they still had the tensions, as we've said. However, in the 1970s, there was this huge geopolitical change called the Sino-Soviet split. And then we saw how the US and China started to become a little bit more in touch with the other. Something that did not last a long time, because then in the end of the 1980s, 1990s, there was a big crackdown in Tiananmen Square in China. So then this connection between West and China started to become a little bit separated again, right? So we have seen how in these more recent years, relations between global powers shifted a bit. However, I would say that Russia's annexation of Ukraine in 2014, it's an important moment in history when these relations were really damaged with the West. And maybe this is when the relation between China and Russia started to become a bit more closer. So, Alexei, you were there in Ukraine when this happened. How do you assess that the China-Russia connection shifted or got closer together after these geopolitical developments?
So I would notice 2 points. The first is that between Russia and China, there are no reasons to be like enemies or competitors. Why? Because all the tensions we saw in 20th century between Russia and China were more situational than systematical. I mean that when in Soviet Union there was in a period when the personality of Stalin was criticized, Mao Zedong, who was the leader of China there, saw it as a personal threat, not the threat from Soviet Union as a state, but personal threat and the threat to his personal power. So the first wave of the tensions between Soviet Union and Communist China took place only because of this fear of Mao Zedong for his personal career, let's say. The second wave of their tensions in 70s later was because China in some moments was afraid of Soviet Union, and that Soviet Union would somehow invade or take some territories. So after these tensions disappeared, we will see the second point, that internally these two countries are very close to each other. China is a communist dictatorship. Russia has fake elections, but who cares? And for Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping in some moments is a icon is an example. Russia likes a lot these digital technologies which are applied in China to control their population. And in many fields, the Chinese model to control the country, to build the propaganda, was applied in Russia too. Another thing is that basically Russia didn't change its ideology. Lenin is still in the Red Square in Moscow. Communist names are all over the map in Russia, in cities, in the streets, in the regions. So even with some elections, even with some liberalism, Russia still is an authoritarian state with anti-Western perception, and the elites of Russia are ex-communists, are ex-KGB servicemen. So they have a lot in common between them personally, and that's why I think we have such close, not friendship, but all right, partnership between personally Xi Jinping and Putin. And also, I think they share the common point of view that they are eternal figures. For 20 years, they meet each other in Davos World Forum, in another, doesn't matter. Presidents of France, the chancellors of Germany, the presidents of the United States, they changed. Putin and Xi, they remain. And that this critical mentality views they share, and that what makes their partnership kind of inevitable.
Yes, I fully agree. I think that's an important component. I mean, in the West, the leaders are always changing. But then on the other hand, you have Xi Jinping and Putin, who met 42 times as of now, and who can really build a common relationship together, not only because they share certain geopolitical interests, but also because their personal situation is very similar. They are both authoritarian leaders, afraid of not only outside actors staging a coup against them, but also perhaps internal actors stepping up against them. So they are to some degree isolated. Maybe in one way or another, they have this unique situation, and they can relate to each other, which perhaps also strengthens their relationship.
Well, guys, coming into this third block of the episode and maybe talking a little bit more about the latest developments and trends in geopolitics, I mean, I think it's fair to say, and correct me if you think otherwise, but I would say that today China dominates lots and maybe most aspects of these two countries' partnerships. We have to say that its economy is 6 times larger at purchasing power parity terms. And of course, that China's power, you could say, in broad terms, is growing in relation to Russia, which is just getting its army obliterated in Ukraine. Its economy, although it has been really resilient, still not as strong as it used to be. So despite that, the war maybe has not diminished Russia's influence and power as many thought it would, it is still not at what it used to be, right? And that really creates a disbalance on their relation. And it talks about how Russia is becoming even more dependent on this huge neighbor, right? And they both know that. So I think that Russia is aware that although they can have a really particular friendship, that imbalance is there. And maybe just going back to 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine happened, I think that this really tightened the embrace between Russia and China. I think that both countries made a clear strategic choice to prioritize relations with each other, and just having in mind how both of them perceive a threat of the US-led West, right? So I think that this deepening of bilateral ties is also joined by an idea of this maybe new global landscape. And that is why you've seen in the news and in these past months how both China and Russia are trying to pursue like this strategy to win the support of the global South, right? And try to push back against US hegemony. And they call this like in the terms of South-South cooperation and trying to take out neo-colonial powers. But at the end, I would say that China really goes with a neo-colonial perspective as well in Africa, in Latin America, right? So I think that argument, it depends how you see it, right? But I mean, the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa group is going to increase in 2024 with the addition of new countries. And despite that this is a contested alliance, it calls about these intentions of maybe having more of an international element of their strategy. How effective it will be, that's up for these coming years to see. But Alexei, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. How do you think that Russia and China are doing in the third world, in other countries across the global south? What is your perspective on that?
I would say that China uses this moment of history, very specific moment when Russia is weakened, both military, geopolitically, uh, to provide kind of, I would name it a slow revenge against Russia, because in every field, would it be economy, would it be influence in Africa, would it be influence in Latin America, would it be world influence, China just pursues its own interests. And in every field where Russia loses its position, loses its power, China comes. In Central Asia, investments in Africa, investments in Latin America, whatever would it be. For Russia, there are no more European markets for its fuel, coal, oil, and so on. All right, China is ready to buy it, but China is ready to buy it and paying with their national currency yuan. So Russia will accept it. Russia has no choice. But with yuan, you can trade only with China. So even in that situation, even buying this oil, even buying this coal, China is basically pursuing its own interests. And I think that the Chinese strategy and tactics is that slowly but surely occupy the position which Russia had in all over the world, economically and globally, and take the lead in this alliance. And finally, Russia will find itself dependent, deeply dependent on China. And I have no idea how they will manage this challenge.
Yeah, it's a bit ironic because earlier on, maybe the Russian perspective has been that it does not want to be the junior partner of the West, so it turned more towards the East, and now it's becoming the junior partner of China, on the other hand. But what I would like to discuss with you guys is, in general, the potential of BRICS, because it's often framed as this kind of alliance to counter the West. And recently it has been announced that several countries will join BRICS in 2024. Among them, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. They have been all invited to join the group. So, what do you guys think? Will this be the new alliance to challenge the West under Russian
Yeah.
Chinese leadership?
Armis, that's a really good question. And we, by the way, for those that speak Spanish, we have an episode solely dedicated to this exact issue. But I mean, now we have to explain it in English as well. And yes, I mean, it is a really interesting perspective. When the news came out, everyone was saying, wow, this is going to completely compete against the G7 and the West. And in a sense, it could sound like it. But if you look at the partners that are invited, I don't think that their geopolitical and economic principles align that much. I mean, we're talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are rivals in the Middle East. We're talking about Ethiopia and Egypt. We also have tensions there in Africa. We're talking about Argentina, which is a lovely country that I have a lot of love for, but both economically and internationally, I don't think they have that much strong status as well. Sorry for those Argentinian friends listening to this. Of course, Brazil is that push factor that really tried to get another Latin American strong power in there. And I don't know. I think that is just my idea. I think that this is an interesting forum where Russia and China can try to balance other decisions, but I do not see a lot of economic, geopolitical, like brute, real dynamics in there. And if the partners inside this extension of the forum, they have tensions among each other, how much can they can put together in the coming years? I think that is my perspective. I don't know, Alexei, how do you see this expansion of the BRICS?
Mostly in Ukrainian analytic community, the expansion of BRICS is viewed very skeptically, because it seems like expanded BRICS will be just blah 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 club. Because, all right, as you said, Saudi Arabia and Iran, what do they really like share? What common points of view, what common visions? Maybe the Palestinian question, nothing less. Brazil is a huge democracy, and China is an authoritarian country. Also, let's take into consideration that Argentina should join the BRICS, but today with the change of their government, they said adios to this bloc. So we'll see. The same could
True.
happen in Brazil with the new elections, with the new president. They will say, "All right, goodbye." Um, so I think as this bloc has within very different countries, sometimes with some direct clashes or some competitiveness between them, economical, political, or ideological. I don't
Yeah.
see any common goals for them that they would work 100% together. So seems like it would be a discussion club for countries which don't like Western liberal democracy order. Yes, they can gather, they can criticize, they can say something about the importance of welfare and ecology. But finally, I don't see any common goals that they can achieve.
But what about you, Armis? What is your perspective on this particular topic?
I think the inherent issue of authoritarian states is reflected here because these countries essentially only pursue their national interest. And that's a huge difference compared to the Western alliances that they try to counter. Because as much as we can talk about internal issues in the West, which are certainly very existent, at the end of the day, all Western countries share liberal values. And those common values are missing in BRICS. I mean, we just talked about it. There are so many internal differences between those countries. We have Argentina that recently moved to a apparently very liberal stance under its new president Milei, or will pursue that transformation. Then we have Brazil, which is going into the completely opposite direction. Then you have Egypt and Ethiopia, which some analysts say are on the verge of a war. Iran and Saudi Arabia, commonly known as adversaries, the biggest adversaries in the Middle East. In short, these countries are not connected by common values. And for this reason, I don't think that
Yeah.
BRICS will be successful beyond being what Oleksiy said, a
Yeah.
discussion club, maybe some isolated actions, but it will, in my opinion, not be comparable to the power of, let's say, NATO or the European
Yeah.
Union,
Totally.
to name the Western alliances as comparison here.
Totally. And I think we are forgetting to talk about that other Asian giant, which is India. And at the end, although India has always remained that, you could say neutral, you could see non aligned strategy, at the end, we can clearly see India is shifting more a little bit into this Western, US led, you could say, broad ideals. I mean, it's true that they will never commit 100%, but they do try to balance a little bit the geopolitics of Asia, or at least that's what the US is trying to do. And you can criticize that. Maybe it's not going to be as successful as we think in the West, but it is another factor to have in mind as well.
Now, let's come back to the China-Russia relationship specifically. We already discussed historically related tensions between the two countries, but now in this section that revolves around the current developments, Fabio, I wanted to ask you what kind of tensions or limits are constraining Russia's and China's relationship today?
Just wanted to mention maybe three main limits of this partnership between Russia and China, or at least what I've perceived, and maybe you guys have a couple more to say in here. But I would say that one of them, well, two of them really well connected. It's the limits regarding everything that has been happened in Ukraine. One of it, which we've talked about a lot in the podcast, it's that limit regarding Putin's nuclear rhetoric, something that Xi Jinping clearly stated as a red line, that they will not accept the use of tactical or strategic use of nuclear weapons. And then we saw how that rhetoric stopped a lot in this war. And another one is the limit regarding China's military support. And although that China has claimed that it's a neutral actor and that's not supporting Russia actively in this war, and that it's calling for peace, there are some reports from Politico and other outlets that have said about this selling of civilian or dual use equipment such as bulletproof vests and other types of equipment in support of Russia. Also, they're allowing North Korean weapons and weapons from Iran to also transition in there, right? So there is clearly a support towards Putin's war in Ukraine. However, I don't think that it's going to be enough for the West to all impose sanctions on China. I think we're far away down the road for that to happen. But I mean, at the end, it's something to have there in as well. I don't know, Alexei, if you have any more insights of how maybe China has been allowing Russia to continue with its objectives in Ukraine. Do you think that is something that has been tried to be limited by the West, or do you think that it's something that truly makes a difference and supports Russia's intentions in Ukraine?
I think there we have two important points. First, is that China tries to be really more or less neutral in a way it could, because till now we didn't see any evidences of state supply to Russia of Chinese armaments or even of Soviet old style armaments, and that is a good achievement for Ukraine and for the West, because as long as China doesn't give Russia some weapons, we can have some hope that we will win this war. The second thing is very important, that for China, the principle of territorial integrity is one of the crucial ones. And Ukraine was always following this principle regarding Taiwan. And China said in various occasions with Crimea or recently occupied and annexed areas of Ukraine, the Kherson region, the Zaporizhia region, which Russia annexed in autumn 2022, that China will not recognize these changes in borders. So this principle, I think, one of the key principles which distance China from open and complete assistance to Russia.
Yes, Alexei, that is really good, valid points, and I think that the last limit that I wanted to discuss for this blog is those limits regarding this structure or the shape of this partnership. And up to today, although that China and Russia have like these connections, it is not, it hasn't taken the measure of an actual definition of an alliance with a binding document, right? Which is the case for NATO, which is the case for this Western other bloc. Even though they have a lot of points in common against this maybe common perceived foe, there's still not a lot of constituency and consistency of this community of values, right? As we have mentioned before. And they do have these similar grievances about just interference in their own affairs, but they have not yet been able to formulate like this positive shared alternative of a US-centric order, right? So although there is this connection between the two of them, we still see there's a lot of unresolved issues here and there, as we've explained across the episode. Anyways, guys, I think that has been a really interesting conversation. I think we have talked many different angles, and I think our listeners have a maybe better understanding on this interesting relation between these two huge global players. However, I wanted to maybe discuss for just the end of the episode hot topics to have our eyes open for and what might be next of this relationship. I'm going to say just the first one and see how you guys think of it, but I would say that in the coming years, we're definitely going to see the continuation of this Sino-Russian convergence. I think this is the most likely case. Although it's not set in stone, I think that progress is going to accelerate, and the war in Ukraine is definitely going to push Russia more into that angle. But what do you think, Alexei and Aramis? Do you think that this will converge, or those tensions that we've discussed about territory and other elements will play a role in maybe separating these two countries again?
So, in my opinion, at the end of the day, despite anything we have said so far, the partnership between Russia and China is still very solid. Because as we've seen, even in the wake of the war in Ukraine, where the West tried to drive China away from Russia, in the end, China decided to hold on to this partnership and even risk sanctions against itself, and even decided to cooperate with a country that is now largely isolated on the international stage. And I think that the war in Ukraine and this decision by China is really a major turning point, as we've discussed earlier today, that both are really serious about this relationship. If I compare it to other Western alliances, which of course try to lead the world in one way or another, then I would come back to my earlier point that the Western alliance has those common values and they align on many policies, and this will allow them to also take common decisions. And being the bigger economies, I think the West is still more of a heavyweight in international relations than Russia and China. But if we will see this growing tendency of populism and nationalism in the West, if Western countries increasingly decide to switch from multilateral decision making towards unilateral decision making, then the Russian Chinese axis could really become the leader of the world, in my opinion, because these countries resemble huge economic power, especially relating to China. On the other hand, Russia is a country that has a lot of natural resources, which are decisive for the world economies. So there's really a lot of power situated in those two countries. And if the West is not able to find a common ground against this axis, I think it really will be China and Russia dominating world politics. But realistically, what we are seeing so far is that even when populist and nationalist leaders take over Western countries, there is still strong cooperation and the liberal order is still persisting. So my opinion is that it will be the West guiding world politics in the years ahead, but there is certainly a profound challenge coming from the East. What's your opinion, Alexei?
I think there are two main points which are crucial for development of Russian-Chinese relations. And they're kind of obvious. First is the outcome of war, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and the second one is development of the events internally in Russia and China. Because we can say that the both countries are dictatorships, and dictatorships are very bad at solving internal crisis, challenges, and problems. China and Russia have a lot of such challenges, and we don't know what the situation in Russia will be after the end of the war in Ukraine. Well, whatever outcome would be, Russia would be critically weakened. And this weakness opens the door for a lot of possibilities and for a lot of challenges. National question, religious question, the struggle between more liberal model or more dictatorial model, and so on. We don't know how it will be ended. So I think the challenges within China and Russia will define their future. If they will manage those challenges successfully, all right, we could see some very strong cooperation and, as you said, Aramis, some kind of leadership from their side. If their challenges will take all their attention and resources, situation internationally will continue to be with a pro-Western model, which is kind of dominating right now in the world.
Well, guys, I think that has been an amazing conclusion for this episode. And thank you so very much for all the listeners that take their time to listen to our analysis. Just maybe a couple things to mention is we did not talk a lot about a really important geopolitical element in here, which is Taiwan. I think we will dedicate an episode solely to Taiwan and its current affairs, because there's going to be elections in Taiwan in 2024 as well. So I think we're definitely going to talk about it in the coming months. And for anyone that would like to maybe take a more in-depth analysis, I would recommend Henry Kissinger's On China book. He talks a lot about these U.S.-China, USSR relations in the 70s, so definitely a nice book to read. But thank you so much for listening to me. I don't know, guys, if you have anything, any last remarks.
Yeah, thank you for listening, and looking forward to the future developments and analyzing it here at Warrior Diplomacy.
Thank you, everybody, for being with us, and let's hope that any form of development of Russian-China relations will not lead us to some more cruel and bloody conflicts.